Give it over. It's the title of today's sermon. And one passage or one verse of Scripture just kind of sets the stage for the whole chapter in Hebrews that this comes from. It's the first verse of the book of Hebrews, the first verse of chapter 11 in Hebrews. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. One verse. That's the introduction. The rest of this chapter, Paul takes up all of these different, if you would like to read it perhaps this afternoon or later, all of the different ways that faith has touched the people of God. Each new story begins with by faith, by faith, by faith. These situations occurred, these stories that we know. This is what we talk about when we talk about giving it over, because it's about faith. No doubt what Shirley described this morning on her trip down 35, is that the same road that I come in? Well, that was my concern, you know. Last night when I talked to Tony, talked to Shirley, talked to Sally and some others, I said, my concern is not between here and the Speedway, it's between the Speedway and Warsaw, 5 miles down that hill. So I know what you're talking, because last year when we had one snowstorm, I was coming and I'd taken Susan's car, which is, I have to sign it out in order to be able to bring it, but I thought it was a little more stable than my Camry. But I rounded one little spot right there, and all at once I realized I didn't have any control at all. It just, and I know the spot, so I slowed way down today. And you start to thinking everything that you learned in driver's ed, everything that you learned from parents, steer with the slide, don't try to overcompensate, don't slap on the brakes. And somehow, someone other than me took control, and instead of going over the hill and being late for church, if at all, the car just righted and we went right on. Story after story, perhaps you can tell yourselves of times when in these kind of snowy conditions you have lost control of the car, and nothing by your own doing. It's just when rubber can't get to the concrete or the blacktop, when it's on ice, there is no traction. We know that. And so consequently, it's just on its own. One time, 20 or more years ago, well, more than that probably, when the kids were involved in 4-H, Megan and I were going from Frankfurt, from our home in Frankfurt, West Frankfurt, to Harrodsburg, which is a little trip for us, to the regional or the area speech or demonstration, some kind of meet. I'd gone to the barn to feed the horses. It was snowing, but it wasn't bad. It was just snowing. From there, around the road and on out, about 2 miles from where we live, 3 maybe on the road, a mile as the crow flies, what was an inconvenience turned to a tragedy. And right on the Evergreen Road, which none of you know, but nonetheless, it's a curvy road. Well, Janie knows the Evergreen Road. On the Evergreen Road, we went around a hill and down and came up, and I knew I'd lost control of the car. I knew I'd lost control. And I thought, I see something coming. I thought we were going to have a head-on collision, and we were going 35 miles an hour, so I didn't realize it had gotten that slick. Megan had not fastened her seatbelt. She was working on her makeup, and she was getting ready for it to look good for this demonstration contest. So she didn't have on a seatbelt, and all at once, the car just starts to spinning around, and the next thing I know, we end up against a tree that's in the front yard of the Baptist minister's house. Wham! Just like that. I don't know how long we were there. His name's Joel Sturdom, a dear friend of mine. His wife, Carolyn, came out to the car. I don't know if we'd been there 2 minutes, a minute, 30 seconds, 5 minutes when she realized we were out there. Came out to the car and took us into the house. Everything was okay besides the car. It was pretty banged up, but no one was hurt. Over and over and over, during this time of year, we can get together and tell slick road stories. These are stories that really illustrate what faith is all about. Because it's like the country music song. And if there are any country music aficionados here who know who sang this, I don't know. If Laura was here, she would be able to tell us. Jesus, take the wheel. Shirley was referring to that in her sermon too. Jesus, take the wheel. You don't have time to say it. It's just like you say, well, here we go, Lord. It's you and me. It's like my old friend Oz that I've given examples before when he was going down the hill with a trailer full of old broken down washing machines somewhere over in Lexington. And he lost control of the trailer, and there was a rock wall on the side. And Oz says, I said to the Lord, it's you, me, and these washing machines, God. You, me, and the washing machines. We just have to give it over. By faith. By faith. That's what we say. These are concrete examples. How about, you made it, how about the examples? How about the things that go on in our lives that aren't about driving on slick roads or snow? How about the situations in our lives when we feel like we have done all we can do? All the things that whatever it is that we can do, and we just have to say to God, you've just got to take this. You've got to take it. I've got to give it over to you. Give it over isn't a phrase we normally use too much, not really a good one, but it tells what this is about. To give over what it is that is troubling, what it is that you can't control. And at that time, we need to say to God, we need to think it, I'm giving it over to you. I'm not prescribing how you're going to answer it. I'm not prescribing what's going to be the outcome. I'm just saying, God, I can't go any further. Now, what do you want me to do? The example that I gave a minute ago of going to the demonstrations with Megan, that time we had this big old Cadillac that we'd purchased, used, and it's about half the size of this church, I think. And that thing took flight, and I thought, boy, this is going to be wild when this lands. But probably it was a good thing it was a big car, because I think the tree took the worst shot of it. But I had nothing to do with that. And it's the same thing with God. Tell God, here it is. Tell God, here it is. I give it over to you. We've been there again and again, haven't we, in our lives? Where do we go in our career selections? What do we do with the things that are important in our lives? What do we do? How do we make these decisions? And I just keep this verse of Scripture open for you here because we can read it again and again. Hebrews 11:1. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. A struggle, a challenge, whatever it is that we are going through, central to everything that we know, and it's contrary to everything we know, to let go. The phrase let go and let God has been popular. We let it go and we let God have it. Let God have it. I'm not, you might find this strange to hear coming from the pulpit, I'm not a deeply crazy, over-the-top religious person. But I have a very strong faith in the power of what God can do in our lives. Now, I feel like before we give it over, we need to do what we can do. We need to do what we can do to help right whatever the situation is, to help set the road straight, to help get the car on the right path. When we were talking about this a minute ago, we were talking about losing control on ice and how when you have that happen, you don't have time to think about what to do. you have to react. And finally, there is nothing to do but give it over. Thirdly, I haven't numbered the first 2 points, you can just guess at that. Thirdly, we accept what happens with God. We accept where the car lands. We accept the outcome. Shirley was lucky. I think 35 probably ought to be straightened. That ought to be next after you get through all the inconvenience you got. Now notice, Tony, they got things across the road you can't even sneak around them on 42 anymore. Great big bulldozers and stuff. When you get through with that inconvenience, you folks that live out that way and have to go that way, my goodness, that's a long way around. Maybe we ought to take on 35 next. It's a really hilly road. When that happens, though, you know you're going to be in some danger. You have to take other precautions. In our lives, when we face challenges, we have to be prepared for what is coming. We have to be prepared as best we can, and then, if you haven't gotten the message now, you just have to give it over. Through the life and the work of this church, I realize for those of you who join us from around the state and other places in the country and from our own church membership who's there, church is not a huge part of your life, but it's part. For some, it's a little bit more than others. For some, it's just something that's just now and then a convenience. Well, obviously for me, since you hired me to do this job, it's a big part of what I do. And I want to make it the best possible experience that I can humanly for you. To have the opportunities to meet God. To have the opportunities to share. To do these things. If we can say to God, just let me use a little of the talents that you have given me. Just a small portion. And we combine that with all of the other folks that we have, then there is no limit to what we can do. No limit to where we can go. We talked about this last week. No limit to what we can achieve. Churches are changing. Life is changing. Where before we could look out over the church and think, well, this person's been here for 5 generations, 4, 3. This person's been here such a long time. That's the way the church has just grown this way. Now we have people coming in from other places. We have people joining us. It's a new day. And we say to God, let me give it to you and lead us what you want us to do. How you want this to happen. By Miss Fay, I talk about it at Bridgeport, God rest her soul. She should have been an investigative reporter, because when anyone new would walk in the church, before they could get to their seat, she would know what their name was, how old they were, who their parents were, if they'd grown up in the community, and if they had any family, before they could get to the seat. Very effective. I said, Faye, that's just being nosy. We got to let that happen on our own. Now we find that because the world is so broad, so changing, this is the norm. That's norm, that's not snorm. This is the norm that we are responding to. How do we work with what God gives us and then at the same time give it over for Him to lead us? That's a question that we have to deal with each individually and in the life and the work of the church.